The capacity to learn, steal, or copy the technique of another in a battle shonen is one of the most common ways to prop up a character's strength. Especially in worlds where most characters possess one main ability, being able to incorporate several unique powers into your own fighting style is a skill into itself that'll put a fighter in an upper echelon. This fact is especially true for Yuta Chrollo, the cursed child with the copy curse technique, and Chrollo Lucifer, the skill hunter of HunterxHunter. While some may be expecting a straightforward power scaling video, that isn't all I want to accomplish with this comparison. Today, very similarly to my Isagi versus Maharaga video, rather than merely compare Yuta and Chrollo's power to see who would win a contest of might, I'm going to be breaking down their skills, conditions, and mindsets as copycats, specifically in order to see who between them is more adept in their role. The first and arguably most important thing to understand and compare before deciding who the better mimic is analyzing what the conditions of Yuta and Chrollo's copying techniques are. As is the case, do not make any particular character too broken. For the most part, characters within stories such as these won't be able to look at a technique and steal it or replicate it free of charge. So, from a base level, the question becomes, which ability allows for the least resistance when copying and using it in battle? Skill Hunter or Copy? Starting with Yuta is interesting because both as a sorcerer and copycat, Yuta has two entirely separate eras that are relevant to this discussion. Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 0 is Yuta's debut, and it's the first time we get to see his copy curse technique in effect. Against Geto, we see that Yuta is able to replicate Inamaki's cursed speech with no difficulty or conditions being filled, as opposed to the consumption-based limitations we see imposed on him later. With the fully manifested soul of Rika Orimoto bound to him, Yuta's initial curse technique was absolutely unconditional. This is not only demonstrated in Volume 0 itself, but further backed up by Kenjaku in Chapter 90. The lack of conditions and restrictions due to his endless well of curse energy makes Yuta, in a word, absolutely broken. Pretty much any technique in the series could be added to his arsenal, just by observing it being used at this point, and no matter how high the cost of activation would normally be, barring aberrant examples like Sukuna or Jackpot Hikari, no sorcerer in the verse would possess a deeper reserve of curse energy than Akotsu. After releasing Rika's soul, however, this fact dramatically changes, and it is the Yuta portrayed in the mainline story of Jujutsu Kaisen that I'll be harping on for the most in this video. This version of the character is much more restricted and down to earth in comparison to his old self, for a multitude of reasons. One of the biggest being that there are only two ways for him to access the storage of techniques that he's copied. The first one that we're introduced to is the complete manifestation of Rika. In Chapter 178, the explanation for this was made clear. By manifesting all of Rika's power, he's able to tap into another source of cursed energy for him to use and the technique stored inside of her. To make an equation to Chrollo, Rika basically acts as Bandit's secret, so without her completed form in play, he's unable to utilize his arsenal. While the connection between the two is in full swing, Yuta can use any technique he's copied. However, this connection only lasts for 5 minutes. Off rip, this is pretty limiting because it means that in most fights, Yuta is encouraged to either delay the use of his copy till he's figured his opponent out, or start the fight with an extreme level of intensity in order to finish it all before his connection times out. We see in Sendai Colony that 5 minutes is more than enough time to deal with two sorcerers and one curse spirit of somewhat relative standing to him, but this is something he has to consider when fighting. The second method of accessing his copy techniques is through the opening of his domain expansion, Mutual and Authentic Love. By doing this, he gains all of the typical domain benefits, and his Sure Hit is just one of the copied abilities that he selected for any given opponent, while the swords that lay scattered on the ground are randomly imbued with the effects of the rest of Yuta's arsenal, thus allowing for a varied approach to battle within his domain. The drawback here is that Yuta doesn't know which technique each katana holds until he grabs it, and each sword is only one use. But neither of these elements seem to effectively hold him back in combat, as we see him fight pretty skillfully in Chapter 250 and 251. For the most part, he's quick on the draw when it comes to finding a new blade, and he conveniently enough is able to work with whatever technique he picks into his plan of attack. Another benefit of the domain is that using it doesn't require him to fully sustain his connection with Rika, meaning this doesn't impact his 5-minute timer outside of his barrier. We know this for certain because creating that connection was something that he did after being cut down by Sukuna and the dismantling of his barrier. By combining these two methods of combat, Yuta should be able to circumvent the time limit problem that we've addressed thus far. Now, I've talked about the limitations Akotsu is placed under when it comes to using these copied abilities, but what he has to do in order to acquire them in the first place might be his greatest hurdle, at least in character. In chapter 267, a few things about Yuta's conditions for copying are made clear. The first is that he must consume a part of the sorcerer whose technique he wants. The larger portion of the body and more vital to the sorcerer, the better. The second is that the consumed portion cannot be regenerated, as this nullifies the value of eating that part in the first place. And the third is that he needs an understanding of the curse technique's framework to maximize its efficacy in battle. While this may seem inconvenient to some, in effect, Yuta is able to achieve this pretty simply. Whether it be through consuming the remains of sorcerers who wouldn't be able to heal anyway, or simply consuming sorcerers that he's killed in combat, Yuta would be able to satisfy all of these conditions quite easily in theory. In comparison to Chrollo, I would argue that he has it quite easy. In fact, in order for Chrollo to steal an ability using Skill Hunter, he must clear 4 conditions of his own. The first is that he must witness the desired Hatsu in action. The second is that he must ask questions about their Nen and have those answered. The third is that the Nen user's palm must make contact with Bandit Secret, his book of stolen Nen abilities. And the fourth and final condition is that all of the aforementioned prerequisites must be accomplished within an hour. We see an example of what Chrollo's approach to fulfilling these conditions may look like in chapters 95 and 96 when he steals lovely Ghost Rider from Neon. In seeing this and comparing the process to Akotsu's, I find Chrollo's conditions and limitations to be much more cumbersome. Both characters require some level of info dumping about the ability that they want to acquire. However, as is displayed in his fight against Uro, Yuta is capable of copying a curse technique just by properly observing it in action and then consuming a portion of her body. Contrasting this, Chrollo must not only see the Nen be used in front of him, but also must have his inquiries answered, which may be difficult against an opponent who's on guard or cautious Nen users in general. The straightforward nature of consumption leading to a successful copy also means that, if he so pleased, Yuta could just kill anyone that had the technique he desired and have Rika handle the rest. Even if Chrollo is easily capable of killing another Nen user, there are many non-combative hoops that he must jump through first, and in most cases, the originator of his stolen Hatsu dying is a horrible result. It absolutely nullifies all of the hard work that he put in. When talking about usage cases, however, I think who has the better ability is slightly more contentious. Unlike with Copy, Skill Hunter does not place a strict 5-minute timer on Chrollo, meaning that he has no incentive to piecemeal his usage of his Nen so as to not burn out his abilities. He also doesn't have to expend a massive portion of his aura to use this technique in the form of a domain, and can just generally avoid the activation headache that Yuta must deal with. He does, however, have a strict limit of how many abilities he can use at once, and when Skill Hunter was first introduced, he even had the downside of needing to hold Bandit Secret open to the proper page of the technique that he wanted to deploy. After running into an ability that required 2 hands, however, Chrollo was able to add Double Face to his innate kit, resulting in the ability to bookmark a page and use 2 stolen abilities simultaneously. On this improved basis, I actually think Skill Hunter is the more convenient technique. With the bookmark modification, Chrollo is able to keep his hands free for close quarters combat, as well as effectively double his attacking options at any given moment, all without the time or energy cost that Yuta has to shoulder. Normally, this deadlock would leave this decision at an impasse. However, Chrollo's ability has some miscellaneous drawbacks that put Yuta's copy technique slightly over the edge holistically. As I mentioned before, we know that in Chrollo's case, he can lose the acquired Hatsu if the original user of the Nen he stole dies. This consequence can only be sidestepped in the event of post-mortem Nen occurring. Losing a technique that's already been obtained can technically happen in Yuta too, but the chances of this happening are significantly lower, and we've actually never seen this happen to him in universe. Skills leaving the pages of Bandit Secret is something that has happened several times in HunterxHunter, however. If that wasn't enough, Chrollo must adhere to the limitations and personal interpretations of the victim's Hatsu, and this adds yet another level of restriction that confines what he's able to accomplish very casually. In Akotsu's case, such a restriction has never been confirmed. While both techniques have their obvious pros and cons, with Yuta having a much easier time in the acquisition phase of copying, and current Chrollo being able to deploy his stolen techniques with fewer barriers to entry, if you were to give the same character Skill Hunter or Copy, the better ability 9 times out of 10 would be Yuta's. The quality of the technique itself isn't all that matters though, as the next section of this comparison will focus on the skill of the users themselves, their mentality, and how they're able to apply these techniques within their stories. How Chrollo and Yuta apply their skills in combat is just as, if not more important than what these skills are on a foundational level. And when comparing two characters of the copying variety, one of the easiest ways to quantify their skill or success with their techniques is a measurement of quantity. How many abilities Yuta and Chrollo have been able to successfully acquire, while not the end-all be-all, does give us a benchmark for how capable they both are of working around the previously described limits of Copy and Skill Hunter. Not including Rika or Copy itself, Yuta has shown us a maximum of 8 techniques under his belt, 7 of which he had stored all at the same time. Within his domain in the battle against Sukuna, he showed off a majority of his arsenal: Curse Speech, Hair-based Shikigami, Sky Manipulation, Technique Extinguishment, G-War Staff, and Shrine. The only technique he possessed at the time left in reserve was Kenjaku's Brain Hopping ability, which wouldn't have been very useful in this context. The Limitless is the final technique Akotsu was able to copy. However, he'd only be capable of somewhat effectively using it in Gojo's body, which he is no longer piloting. Even if he were capable of possessing Gojo's corpse indefinitely, it's made clear that Rika won't follow any vessel aside from Yuta's, which seals off his access to the previously acquired curse techniques. This amount is met pretty evenly by Chrollo, who, throughout his time in the story, has shown off 10 stolen abilities total, with up to 9 of those being fairly safe to assume he had simultaneously. Lovely Ghostwriter, Gallery Fake, and Black Voice are all net abilities that Chrollo lost due to the originator of the technique dying, but he should be left with 7 remaining stolen techniques: Indoor Fish, Fun Cloth, Teleportation, the Sun and Moon, Order Stamp, Convert Hands, and Love Dial 6700. This pretty even amount of replicated abilities might lead you to believe that Chrollo and Yuta stand on somewhat even footing here, but remember that I said these numbers merely act as benchmarks. What's important is the context surrounding them. Determining Copy has a much lower acquisition cost, as we did before, should result in Yuta having many more techniques at his disposal. However, the results show us the exact opposite. Chrollo has stolen and used more abilities on screen despite having the more difficult set of circumstances to overcome. This is because Chrollo unambiguously surpasses Akotsu in 2 key factors that are quite important for this comparison. The most obvious of these is the intelligence gap. Yuta has shown himself to be a forward-thinking tactician, especially during the month leading up to the Shinjuku Showdown. However, that's pretty much it. With more pieces on the board, an entire month to prep, and unique information that Sukuna couldn't have possibly possessed, Akotsu was able to catch Sukuna off guard a number of times. This is impressive. However, I would argue that Chrollo is consistently a much more cerebral and calculated fighter. In his battle with Hisoka, he too utilizes the prep time allotted to him, but does so with significantly greater personal success and finesse. At every turn, Chrollo is able to lead Hisoka to false conclusions, misunderstandings, or disadvantageous positions, all through his manner of speaking and fighting. On its own, this would be an impressive display of tactics and fight IQ, but its prominence gets boosted even more when who he's fooling is taken into account. Hisoka is one of the most skilled and intelligent Nen users in the entire story, and while some may argue that he was cheated in this fight, being capable of doing that to him in the first place is a masterful display of Chrollo's intelligence and Nen mastery. Yuta's intelligence feats seem more like clever parlor tricks or sleight of hand by comparison. This fact leads me to believe that if you gave Chrollo and Yuta the exact same curse techniques or Hatsu, it would be Chrollo who capitalizes on these abilities the most. This explains a better usage of skill hunters, sure, but it doesn't explain the gap in quantity in lieu of the handicap. To explain that, one must understand the personalities and intentions of these characters a bit more. To put it simply, Yuta is a good kid. Unless the person he's facing is wearing Geto's face or has 4 arms, he's never fighting with the resolve to throw everything away for the sake of power or victory. Even when going up against threats like this, we don't see a hunger for strength or technique acquisition in a way you might expect for someone with his moveset. Despite it probably being very useful to do so, Yuta doesn't bother eating Ishigori's arm to add Granite Blast to his technique smorgasbord, and among many of his allies that would be much less helpful in a fight to the death with Sukuna, we don't see him consider adding them to the menu to accrue more strength for himself. Because one of Copy's conditions requires such a high price for the one who is copied, Yuta isn't willing to spam ingest useful techniques because that's just who he is. Chrollo, on the other hand, is a thief and a murderer, a person who doesn't have any qualms trampling over others if it's for the sake of the troop. Because of this, there are very few characters whose abilities are off limits, And if they are, it's probably because fulfilling the conditions of Skill Hunter would be impossible, not because it goes against his moral code. We even see that he's willing to steal the Nen abilities of troop members. However, I imagine this is at least partially because he knows he can give their Nen back. What this difference means is that Chrollo is willing to go further than Yuta if it means getting stronger and acquiring a wider array of abilities. In tandem with his superior intelligence and extreme proficiency with all of the Hatsu that he wields, it's safe to say that on the basis of skill, Chrollo is superior. Now, while Chrollo and Yuta may seem completely equal based on the allocated points granted earlier in this video, what shows up on the stat sheet doesn't exactly tell the whole story. Yuta may have the advantage in terms of what technique he possesses in a vacuum, as Copy is significantly more easy to use than Skill Hunter, but the gap here is not so great as you overcome the pretty sizable difference in competency that lies between them in terms of application. You'd think because Yuta has ventured much deeper into the highest levels of power in his universe than Chrollo in his, we'd be able to conclude that Yuta has gotten much more mileage out of his technique, but this ignores much context outside of their copycat or stealing abilities. Yuta is blessed in many ways, one of which is his immense pool of cursed energy and special grade level Shikigami. Even if he never possessed the copy curse technique in the first place, he'd probably still be a special grade sorcerer, and if not quite on that level, he wouldn't be too far off. Much of his success can be attributed to these natural gifts that have no bearing on Copy and his effectiveness with it. Chrollo does not have the same standing within HunterxHunter without Skill Hunter. A competent close quarters fighter he is, sure, but even down to his fundamental manipulation of Nen, the core of Skill Hunter as a Hatsu, he is significantly more impressive than Yuta. Akotsu is stronger than Chrollo when measuring within the context of their own stories, but that has much less to do with copying proficiency than it does innate talents and unique universe circumstances. Yuta is actually lambasted by Gojo for being pretty unwieldy with his manipulation of cursed energy and refinement with it, and this is just never something that comes up as a problem for Chrollo. No matter which way I look at it, from the perspective of copying, it is Chrollo who I deem to be the more well-rounded character. He has stolen and used a larger pool of techniques than Yuta, displayed a greater level of ingenuity and finesse with these abilities, and accomplishes this all while having more cumbersome restrictions. If you want to double check my work, just ask yourself this. Between the two, who would function better if they swapped techniques? Yuta with Skill Hunter and Chrollo with Copy. Unique hurdles present themselves in both instances, but I'm much more inclined to believe that Chrollo would have an easier time with his new ability than Yuta with his. Becoming a cannibal wouldn't be fun, sure, but after he gets over that little hurdle, it's basically smooth sailing. Any technique that he wants can be acquired after seeing it a few times, killing his opponent, or taking a piece of them and popping it in his mouth like a senzu bean. Yuta would be in a much worse position by comparison. Curse techniques like sky manipulation, the Shikigami, shrine, or the brain transplant would all be impossible to acquire given Akotsu's character and the passive way he'd have to go about fulfilling these conditions. I ask this question and make this final comparison to say, if each character walked a mile in the other's shoes, Chrollo would have a significantly easier time than Yuta. While his natural blessings made this a close contest, the superior copycat is none other than Chrollo Lucifer. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and hit the bell. Let me know down in the comments if you want to see more videos where I compare or power scale two characters on the basis of a similar trait like I did here, and check out my Isagi versus Mahoraga video for more of that right now. And also, let me know if you want to just see a full-blown rematch, straight up power scaling, who's stronger between these two characters. In any case, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.